This morning, I discovered that I had been locked out of my own ranch. But just 48 hours later, I forced that woman to kneel and apologize before the entire community. And no, I didn't break the law. I remember the excitement during the purchase, the charming smile of the realtor, and the reassuring promises that the HOA barely functioned and would never intrude on my privacy. However, 2 weeks into my so-called peaceful retreat in Pine Ridge Estates, an official email arrived in my inbox. It was from Victoria Harrington, the domineering president of the HOA, demanding that I attend a mandatory meeting. Arriving at the community center with a mixture of apprehension and defiance, I soon realized that the gathering was less a discussion about community spirit and more a tribunal for imposing arbitrary rules. Victoria's tone was icy and insistent as she outlined ludicrous regulations. Everything from the color of my house's siding to the height of the grass on my property had to conform to an absurd ideal of uniform beauty. When she zeroed in on my plans to refurbish an old dilapidated shed and convert it into a workshop, a project meant to honor the rustic charm of the land, I felt a surge of indignation. I attempted to explain in earnest yet measured tones that my property was secluded enough not to disturb the established residential aesthetics, but Victoria was unmoved. As she smiled with a veneer of condescension and uttered, "We value consistency here, Mr. Reynolds," I realized that this was more than a dispute over aesthetics. It was a power play. Later that day, while I inspected my property and tried to piece together the rationale behind the newly erected fence, Carmen Diaz, my warm and forthright neighbor, pulled me aside. In a hushed conversation filled with grim undertones, she warned me of Victoria's notorious penchant for bullying new residents. I felt a cold dread as I began to suspect that my dream of unburdened freedom was rapidly morphing into a nightmare orchestrated by an individual with an unhealthy desire for control. Each step I took on the property that morning felt heavier than the last. The metal fence, a looming testament to someone else's dominion over my life. Over a cup of weak coffee in my modest kitchen, I replayed the morning's events and calculated my next steps. There was no immediate solution, only the growing determination to reclaim my home and assert my rights. I decided then and there that I would not allow Victoria or her ilk to dictate the terms of my existence. For the first time since my arrival at this ranch, I truly understood the price of freedom and what I was willing to pay for it. The shock of that morning gradually yielded to steely resolve. As I surveyed my fenced-in property, I stood at the base of the towering metal wall, my eyes tracing every inch of its cold, unyielding surface, and felt a deep surge of anger. I grabbed my phone and dialed Victoria's number with trembling fingers. When she answered, her voice oozed satisfaction as she curtly informed me that the fence had been installed by a majority vote of the HOA to improve security for everyone. But this isn't about security. It's about control, I protested fiercely. Yet she insisted with chilling calm that I must settle all outstanding fees and comply with every regulation before any key to the gate would be returned. My indignation turned to desperation as I tried contacting the local police, only to have them dismiss my plight as a civil dispute that lay beyond their intervention. With mounting anxiety, I returned home and scoured through my property deed and the perplexing contract I'd signed when purchasing the ranch. To my surprise, I discovered an anomaly. The legal boundary indicated on the map did not match what I saw before me. There was an extra strip of land, the very corridor where the gate now stood, that wasn't clearly part of my property, yet was inexplicably included in the HOA's jurisdiction. Determined to find answers, I immediately rang Carmen, who between sympathetic glances and resigned sighs, revealed that she had heard rumors of internal dissent within the HOA. She introduced me to Thomas Mitchell, a cautious yet increasingly forthright member of the HOA board, who had voiced concerns over Victoria's unilateral decisions during recent emergency meetings. Meeting Thomas in a drab coffee shop off the main road, we exchanged heated words about fairness and tyranny. Over bitter espresso, he confided that Victoria had manipulated the process by calling a special meeting without notifying all members properly, a breach of procedure that left many residents questioning her authority. "Mr. Reynolds," he urged quietly, "this isn't just about a fence. It's about the fundamental misuse of power." His words bolstered my determination, and I made the decision then to hire Jennifer Adams, a seasoned real estate attorney renowned for her uncompromising stance on property rights. I visited her sleek downtown office, and amid stacks of legal files and the hum of fluorescent lights, she listened intently as I described my predicament. With her cool, incisive professionalism, Jennifer quickly detected inconsistencies in the HOA's documents. "There's something very off about that extra strip of land," she murmured, pulling out a worn, annotated copy of my deed for closer inspection. Jennifer's investigation uncovered damning details. The disputed land was in fact privately owned and had been wrongfully annexed by the HOA through obscure legal loopholes. That revelation sent shivers down my spine. It meant that Victoria's stranglehold over the community was built on a foundation of falsified authority. Before I could fully absorb this blow, I received an urgent call from Jennifer. She had discovered that Victoria's actions in pushing through the fence installation had bypassed standard voting procedures, rendering them legally questionable. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming. I felt as though the very integrity of the community was being dismantled. As dusk fell, I spent a sleepless night huddled over stacks of documents, my determination intensifying with every inconsistently phrased clause and every dubious signature. Standing at the foot of the fence once more the next morning, I swore that I would reclaim both my property and the dignity of our community. The resolve in my heart was matched only by the spark in Thomas's eyes, as he vowed to gather further evidence of the HOA's misdeeds from those who had silently suffered for years. In the midst of this strife, Carmen continued to be a steadfast ally, discreetly passing along overheard gossip from other neighbors, tales of arbitrary fines, secret meetings, and even more unsettling threats delivered directly to residents' doors. The cacophony of discontent was reaching a fever pitch, and it became clear that the time for quiet acquiescence had long passed. Victoria's dictatorial rule could only lead to more injustices if left unchecked. That very day, fueled by righteous anger, I took the first concrete step by issuing a formal complaint against the HOA's decision-making process. Armed with a folder full of discrepancies, I resolved to hold a face-to-face confrontation that would shake the foundations of this system. I recalled a memory from my corporate days, a board meeting where every word was weighed and measured, and knew that this was a battle of both law and willpower. "This is not just about my ranch," I told myself, the steely determination echoing in my thoughts as I looked up at the unyielding fence that had become both my symbol of entrapment and the spark for a rebellion I could no longer ignore. In the days that followed the explosive developments at the HOA meeting, I found myself drawn into an unexpected web of alliances and secrets that would change the course of this battle. The simmering tensions in the community spurred me to pursue every lead with a determination fueled by both desperation and hope. One misty afternoon, I received a cryptic message from an old acquaintance who had once hinted at the existence of a reclusive figure whose insight into local property matters was legendary. It wasn't long before I discovered that this person was none other than Howard Whitaker, a man whose quiet reputation belied an iron will and a meticulous mind. Determined to gain his trust, I, accompanied by Jennifer, made the journey to the outskirts of town, where Howard's modest, weather-beaten house sat isolated among tall pines and whispering oaks. The drive itself was a reflective journey, as I recalled fragments of local lore about Howard's past exploits, a legendary entrepreneur whose charisma had been eclipsed by the stark simplicity of his later years. His home, a small cottage exuding faded grandeur and mystery, seemed to embody a time when principle mattered more than profit. As we approached his gate, I could feel the weight of countless unspoken stories pressing upon me. I knocked tentatively, and after a long moment of silence, Howard's door creaked open. His lined face and steady gaze exuded both welcome and weariness, as if he had been expecting this confrontation for an eternity. Once inside, in a parlor dimly lit by a single antique lamp, Howard motioned for us to sit on time-worn, comfortable chairs. There was a palpable aura of history in that room, shelves laden with yellowed newspapers, faded photographs of town founders, and legal tomes that spoke of past battles fought on the very soil underfoot. Howard's voice, soft yet imbued with authority, began to weave a narrative of the past. He recounted how, long before the modern HOA had consolidated power, he had acquired several plots throughout the neighborhood with a vision for preserving a delicate balance between individual freedom and communal responsibility. His eyes grew distant as he remembered the days when neighbors trusted one another and respected property lines, not just on paper, but as a sacred covenant between people and the land. Back then, he said in a measured tone, we understood that some boundaries were meant to shield us, not imprison us. I deliberately held onto a slender strip of land to act as a barrier against those who might one day take advantage of our trust. As he spoke, I couldn't help but notice the glimmer of rebellious pride in his eyes. He explained that this very strip, now at the heart of the controversy, was originally conceived as a safeguard to prevent any single entity, no matter how well-intentioned, from wielding absolute control over our lives. Over long moments punctuated by deep reflective pauses, he elaborated on how the community's transformation into an HOA was fueled by a desire for uniformity that ultimately eroded the spirit of independence. Howard's recollections were interspersed with surprising moments of humor and gentle sarcasm, especially when he described his encounters with bureaucrats and self-important developers. They all think they're the heroes of progress, he chuckled softly. But in reality, they're just the architects of our oppression. His words resonated with me deeply. I felt as if this encounter was a convergence of fate, the merging of my personal quest for justice with a man whose lifelong vigil against corporate overreach served as both inspiration and a practical blueprint for resistance. As the conversation progressed, Howard confided in us the details of his ongoing observation of Victoria's maneuvers. He spoke about secret meetings held behind closed doors where decisions were made not in the interest of the community but to consolidate power and control. Victoria is not working alone, he warned. And she has allies who are willing to manipulate legal loopholes and rewrite property boundaries. That fence, for example, is just one symptom of a far deeper malaise. I could feel my pulse quicken with both anxiety and exhilaration, as every word he uttered reinforced the critical importance of reclaiming the disputed strip of land. After a lengthy discussion about legal technicalities and the dynamics of local power, Howard proposed a bold solution. He offered to transfer the thin strip of land, the barrier that had become symbolic of our collective oppression, to me for a nominal fee of $1. Consider it not a purchase, but a transaction for freedom, he said, his tone both matter-of-fact and laced with a hint of challenge. The agreement, however, came with a stringent condition. I had to ensure that the HOA was reformed from within, returning to its original purpose of serving the community rather than controlling it. I spent several moments in silent contemplation, knowing that this was not merely a legal maneuver, but a transformative act that could shift the balance of power in our favor. Our conversation naturally veered into the practical and symbolic implications of this transfer. I asked Howard about his own sacrifices, the years he had spent in isolation, watching helplessly as greedy forces reshaped the neighborhood. With a measured sigh, he admitted that his lifestyle had become an act of rebellion in itself, a continual testimony against the mechanizations of power. I have always believed that one man's principled stand can ignite a spark in the hearts of many, he remarked, his voice soft yet determined. You, Mr. Reynolds, have that spark. With this land, you can ignite a fire that no tyrant can suppress. The passion in his delivery was both contagious and humbling. I recalled earlier moments when the thought of fighting against a system had seemed like a solitary battle, but now I realized that the struggle was shared by all who yearned for freedom. With the chaos behind us and the corrupt reign of Nathan Cooper dismantled, Oak Ridge Heights began its long journey toward healing and renewal. In the weeks following the dramatic showdown at Sovereign Protection, the atmosphere in our community underwent a remarkable transformation. I found myself returning to the familiar rhythms of daily life, albeit now with a heightened sense of purpose and a deep understanding of the power that comes with unity and resolve. Every morning as I unlocked the door to Freedom Motors, I was greeted by the sight of our American flag still flying proudly. It had become a symbol not just of personal remembrance, but of the triumph of everyday citizens standing up to tyranny. Residents once cowed by the heavy-handed tactics of the HOA enforcers began sharing stories of solidarity and hope. In quiet conversations over morning coffee, people spoke of plans to reconstruct the broken bonds within our community and to rebuild the trust that had been shattered by years of fear and manipulation. I made it a point to organize several neighborhood events to foster unity, ranging from community barbecues to town hall meetings where everyone could voice their concerns and dreams for the future. In one such meeting held in the local community center, I looked around at a room filled with determined faces, young families, elderly neighbors, and even the few rebellious teenagers who had grown up witnessing the struggle, and realized that we were indeed a stronger unit than any one corrupt official could ever break apart. The lines of division that Nathan once exploited were slowly fading, replaced by the shared strength of a community that had weathered the storm. Of course, not all wounds healed overnight. There were moments when I revisited memories of that harrowing night, the shattering of my door, the harsh words, and the overwhelming fear that had almost paralyzed me. But with each recollection came a renewed determination not to let those memories be in vain. I channeled the pain into a promise that I would always stand vigilant, never letting our community fall back into silence should another tyrant try to take root. Jessica, ever by my side with unwavering support and legal acumen, often reminded me that change is not a single victory, but a continuous process. "Alex," she said during one of our late-night talks over the clatter of coffee cups in our quiet kitchen. "Today we witness the power of the people. But remember, our fight for justice is never truly finished. We must always be prepared to defend our hard-won rights." Her words resonated deeply, providing me both with comfort and a reminder of the responsibilities that lay ahead. Even the sound of motorcycles on the open road became a comforting reminder of the Iron Liberty's enduring commitment. Derek and his crew continued to patrol the streets, not as aggressors, but as vigilant neighbors, ensuring that no such threat would ever return. Their presence, once feared as an intimidating force, had now evolved into a symbol of community strength and resilience. Every time I saw those sleek bikes rolling by, I couldn't help but smile at the transformation from feared enforcers to heroes in our narrative. Yet, as days turned to weeks and weeks into months, I never forgot that final cryptic message, a reminder that someone in the shadows still held unfinished business. I revisited my recordings, combed through emails, and even re-examined some of the evidence we'd gathered. While much had been resolved, there was still a nagging feeling that more secrets lay hidden within the labyrinth of bureaucratic corruption. With renewed determination, I resolved to keep fighting, to keep digging, and to ensure that every corner of our community was free from the stain of greed. In those quiet moments of introspection, I recorded my thoughts in a battered journal, a keepsake that had witnessed every painful twist and triumphant turn of our journey. I wrote about the lessons learned, about the importance of community solidarity, the strength found in speaking truth to power, and the unyielding spirit of those who refuse to be cowed by oppression. Every scribbled word was both a reminder and a promise that justice, though hard-won, was worth every drop of sweat and every pang of fear along the way. As I now stand on the precipice of a new dawn, I feel a profound gratitude not only for the victory we achieved, but for the collective courage that lit our path. Oak Ridge Heights may never be the same. But it is now a place where every resident's voice is heard, where corruption is met with an unwavering resolve, and where the spirit of defiance continues to thrive. In the end, I know that if any tyrant dares to rise in the future, we will be ready. Armed with truth, united by purpose, and guided by the indomitable will of a community that refuses to be silenced. I close this chapter of my life with a message to all who have been part of this fight. Remain vigilant, for the pursuit of justice is a never-ending journey. And to those still watching, remember that this is not the end. There are always more battles to be fought and more injustices to overturn. As I ride off into another uncertain day, with my flag still flying high and the rumble of my bike beneath me, I carry with me the unyielding belief that together we can make a difference today, tomorrow, and always. Thank you for following this long, winding journey through the dark corridors of corruption, rebellion, and eventual redemption. I hope this story resonates with you, inspires you to never settle for injustice, and reminds you that sometimes even the most unlikely heroes can rise to the occasion. Drop your thoughts and let me know which state you're watching from. That internal dialogue became a mantra, a rhythmic affirmation that bolstered my resolve when the nights grew too long and the uncertainty too vast. I began to integrate these affirmations into my daily routine, pairing them with strategic reviews of our growing dossier of evidence. With every recorded call and captured image, my certainty that the legal scales would one day tip in our favor strengthened considerably. It was in the crucible of these long, tortured nights that I discovered the true cost and the inherent nobility of the battle for freedom. The isolation, with all its shadows and echoes, was not an end but a prelude to a turning point, a necessary phase in the cleansing fire of rebellion. I realized that my struggle was as much about reclaiming my identity as it was about dismantling an unjust system. Every sleepless hour was a tribute to the unyielding spirit of a community that, though fractured by fear, was slowly reawakening to the possibility of change. As the days turned into weeks, the sense of being besieged began to transform. With each new piece of evidence and every encouraging word from a neighbor, the icy grip of isolation was gradually replaced by a cautious warmth, a collective understanding that the night is darkest just before the dawn. I knew that my fight was far from over, and that the road to justice would continue to be paved with both setbacks and small, hard-won victories. And so, standing watch by the gate under a star-studded sky, I vowed that no matter how relentless the siege of anxiety might be, I would persist in my quest for freedom, confident that soon the oppressive walls, both literal and metaphorical, would finally crumble beneath the force of truth and unity. The tension reached its boiling point on the day of the fateful HOA meeting, a gathering that felt more like a high-stakes trial than a community discussion. I entered the meeting hall with a mix of trepidation and calm determination, conscious of every judging stare and whispered remark. The room was tightly packed with residents whose expressions ranged from apathetic resignation to barely contained indignation. And at the center of it all sat Victoria Harrington, her presence as domineering as ever. As soon as the session commenced, Victoria wasted no time in launching an attack against me. "Mr. Reynolds," she began in a tone that was both patronizing and accusatory. "You have proven to be a disruptive element in our community, threatening the very harmony we've worked so hard to maintain." Her words dripped with disdain, painting me as a rebellious outsider with ulterior motives. I listened, silent but seething as Victoria detailed her case with a series of selective anecdotes and distorted interpretations of the rules. My mind raced with the evidence I had painstakingly collected, hidden in a binder beside me. When it was my turn to speak, I rose slowly, feeling the weight of every passing moment. In a measured tone, I recounted the true sequence of events, from the sudden appearance of the fence to the blatant breaches in proper procedure during her so-called emergency meetings. I explained how the disputed strip of land was not part of the legally annexed HOA territory, and that Victoria's actions were in direct violation of both our agreed-upon regulations and established property law. This, I declared, is not about aesthetic uniformity, but about the fundamental right to live freely without the overreach of a governing body that claims ownership over our lives. My voice, though steady, carried the earnest conviction of someone who had nothing left to lose. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, and for the first time that day, I saw a flicker of understanding in the eyes of some residents. Just as the atmosphere began to shift, Jennifer Adams stepped forward to corroborate my claims. With a calm authority, she presented a set of official documents, including notarized copies of my deed and the disputed boundary maps, which conclusively demonstrated that the metal fence encroached upon private property. The room fell into a stunned silence as the undeniable truth stared everyone in the face. A heated exchange broke out between Victoria and Jennifer, voices rising, as Victoria insisted that I was fabricating evidence to sabotage the community's unity. In response, Jennifer's words cut through the chaos like a scalpel. "You cannot govern by fear and deception forever, Victoria. The law is clear, and justice will not be swayed by your personal vendetta." In that moment, the balance of power shifted palpably. Several board members, emboldened by the compelling evidence and the relentless truth I had laid bare, began questioning Victoria's leadership. Even Mark Walsh, who had previously remained silent, rose with a resolute firmness, demanding that the exact boundaries be re-verified and the illegal annexation reversed. The tension in the room was electric as Victoria's facade of invincibility crumbled. In a desperate, breathless plea, she called out for order, trying to steer the conversation back to a scripted narrative of communal welfare. But it was too late. Every resident present had been awakened to the reality. They were living under the oppressive thumb of a leader who was not only misguided but fundamentally abusive of her power. As the meeting deteriorated into impassioned debate and heated accusations, I felt a profound clarity take hold of me. This was not merely my battle. It was a call to arms against any form of corruption that sought to suffocate individual freedom under the guise of community order. The papers Jennifer had unveiled were more than legal documents. They were a declaration of independence, a challenge to the status quo that had burdened our lives for far too long. Throughout the session, my eyes met those of several neighbors who, in that silent exchange, communicated their own stories of hurt and defiance, stories of arbitrary fines, of dismissive bureaucrats, and of dreams stifled by needless regulation. Amid the ensuing uproar, I recorded every word, every objection, knowing that these recordings would one day serve as the definitive chronicle of our struggle. The climax of the meeting arrived when a previously unassuming resident, Robert Blackwell, who had rarely spoken before, unexpectedly stood up. In a calm, measured tone that belied the intensity of the moment, he began to list a series of long-ignored grievances and procedural violations perpetrated by the HOA over the years. With each meticulously recited fact, the assembled crowd grew louder in support. "I've seen too many of us suffer under arbitrary rules," Robert declared, his voice firm yet empathetic. "And it's time for a complete overhaul of this tyrannical system." The effect was overwhelming, a collective roar of approval that resonated like an earthquake through the meeting hall. Victoria's face turned ashen, her authority evaporating before our very eyes. I stood there, heart pounding, as it became undeniably clear that the scales of justice were tipping in our favor. Victoria's desperate attempts to regain control, including a final ultimatum for me to accept a settlement on humiliating terms, only fueled the resolve of everyone present. By the end of the meeting, it was evident that the majority was ready to take a stand, to demand accountability, and to reclaim our community from the clutches of fear and corruption. As I left the hall that day, the echoes of rebellious cries and the sight of determined faces filled me with a renewed sense of purpose. I realized with bittersweet clarity that this battle was far from over, but we had ignited a spark that could no longer be extinguished. In the wake of that tumultuous meeting, the air in our community grew thick with anticipation and trepidation. I returned home to find that Victoria, refusing to accept her impending defeat, had already set her retaliation in motion. The very next morning, as I sipped my lukewarm coffee in the quiet solitude of my kitchen, my phone lit up with a barrage of furious emails. Each message was a calculated attempt to undermine my newfound credibility, laden with legal jargon and subtle threats of further litigation. One message in particular, sent directly from Victoria's personal attorney, declared that unless I immediately ceased all acts of defiance, the HOA would be forced to take drastic legal measures that could irreparably damage my standing in the community. Despite the cold, intimidating tone of these communications, I remained calm, my resolve hardening with every word. Determined to document every aspect of Victoria's campaign of intimidation, I increased the number of cameras around my property and began recording every phone call, email, and in-person encounter. These recordings, I knew, would serve as my shield and sword in the looming legal battle. I contacted Thomas again, who informed me that whispers of a coordinated effort to stage a midnight demolition of the fence had been circulating among other dissatisfied neighbors. In hushed tones over a late-night phone call, we shared our fears and speculated that Victoria might be planning to use her favorite locksmith, a man reputed to have a shady reputation, to break our resolve by physically dismantling our defenses. The very idea of someone forcibly tearing down the barrier that symbolized my defiance sent chills down my spine. But it also galvanized me. I was no longer simply fighting to reclaim my property. I was fighting for the fundamental right of every resident to live without tyranny. That fateful evening, as dusk settled over the neighborhood and the sky turned a deep indigo, I noticed movement near the gate. Through the grainy live feed of one of my cameras, I watched in stunned silence as two uniformed HOA contractors and the mysterious locksmith approached the fence with tools in hand. My pulse raced, and I quickly grabbed my phone to call the police one more time, this time, armed with the damning evidence of their intrusive presence. The dispatcher's curt reply confirmed what I had feared. Despite the clarity of my recordings, the situation would be deemed a civil matter, and they would not intervene. Frustration mixed with a burning sense of injustice. Yet in that darkness, I also saw the seeds of opportunity. I immediately shared the footage with Thomas, Carmen, and Jennifer, urging them to prepare for a decisive showdown that could be broadcast to every member of our community. "We can't let this slide," I texted, my fingers trembling with both anger and determination. The following day brought yet more unexpected developments. Victoria, faced with mounting evidence and public backlash, organized a last-ditch effort to coerce me into a settlement. She personally visited my ranch in the early hours, her presence as imposing as ever, and demanded that I sign a compromise agreement that would effectively transfer control of the disputed land, and thus my freedom, back to the HOA in exchange for what she deemed a generous sum that would paradoxically leave me poorer in both dignity and finances. Our conversation was terse and laden with unspoken threats. "Mr. Reynolds," she hissed, her eyes flashing with barely concealed malice. "If you do not comply, the consequences for you will be severe. We all want to maintain order here, but order comes at a price." I refused, countering her demands with a calm that masked the fury boiling inside me. "I will not surrender my rights under any circumstances," I replied evenly, every word measured and resolute. I was acutely aware that my recorded conversation was now powerful ammunition, a beacon of truth in the face of her baseless threats. Later that afternoon, as I sat with Jennifer and Robert in my modest living room, we pulled all the new evidence, audio recordings, video clips, and detailed logs of every interaction. The gravity of our case became overwhelmingly clear. "The community will not stand by while Victoria continues her reign of terror," Jennifer stated with fierce conviction, her eyes burning with determination. Together, we strategized our next moves to secure a court injunction against any further harassment, and to publicize the evidence so that every resident would be forced to confront the HOA's abuses. Meanwhile, as news of Victoria's aggressive tactics began to leak out, an undercurrent of support swelled among the residents. Late-night phone calls, secret meetings in back rooms, and hushed conversations in the grocery store all confirmed that the community's patience was wearing thin. In one such impassioned conversation with Carmen, she confided, "I've been hiding my anger for too long. It's time we all stand up and demand accountability." Her words echoed my own inner monologue. And in that shared moment of solidarity, I realized that our battle was evolving into something much larger than a single man's fight. It was a battle for the soul of our community. As the final days of this chapter drew near, I could feel the tension transforming into an unstoppable momentum. Every piece of evidence we gathered, every conversation recorded, and every whispered testimony from brave neighbors painted an increasingly damning portrait of Victoria's reign. The once feared enforcer of arbitrary rules was now exposed as a tyrant whose control would soon be broken by the collective will of a community united for justice. I went to bed that night with the steady certainty that the storm brewing on the horizon would soon burst forth in a decisive confrontation. A moment when the scales of justice would finally tip in our favor, forever consigning Victoria's reign to the annals of a dark chapter in our shared history. The morning of the decisive HOA meeting dawned with an almost palpable electricity in the air. I arrived at the community center early, my heart a mix of resolute determination and quiet anticipation. The room was already abuzz with whispers and furtive glances, each resident acutely aware that today was not merely another bureaucratic affair. It was the culmination of our long-fought struggle against tyranny. The deeper we delved into the intricacies of the transfer, the more Howard revealed, not just about the property, but about his own past battles. He recounted a particularly poignant episode where he had clashed with overreaching developers in his youth, a story of resilience, gumption, and quiet defiance that resonated like an old folk ballad. "I was young then, full of ideals and ready to take on the world," he reflected. "And while the world may have grown cynical, the ideals remain as relevant as ever." His narrative was punctuated by vivid recollections of long, sleepless nights spent poring over legal documents, negotiating with stone-faced officials, and fighting for the rights of his neighbors. His experiences reminded me that the struggle for justice was timeless, and that every act of defiance left an indelible mark on the tapestry of community history. Inspired and emboldened by Howard's revelations, I left his home with a renewed sense of purpose. Driving back through winding country roads, I replayed every detail of our conversation, mentally cataloging the legal loopholes, historical injustices, and strategic insights that he had so generously shared. the prospect of reclaiming that thin strip of land was no longer a simple transaction. It had evolved into a clarion call for a complete overhaul of the oppressive system governing our lives. As night fell over the countryside, my mind buzzed with plans and contingencies, each thought intertwining with memories of past uprisings and future hopes. I realized that this alliance with Howard was not just about me, but about rekindling the spirit of resistance in a community that had long forgotten the power of unity. The road ahead was treacherous, laden with legal battles and entrenched systems of power. But with every new piece of evidence and every shared story of past struggles, the promise of a brighter tomorrow glowed with an almost palpable intensity. That night, as I sat alone in my study, surrounded by stacks of notes and legal documents, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of destiny unfolding. Howard's insights had not only equipped me with the tools to challenge the HOA's injustice but had also rekindled my faith in the enduring spirit of community and the transformative power of a single courageous act. I knew that every conversation, every revelation was a stepping stone toward reclaiming the freedom that was rightfully mine, and by extension, restoring it to every neighbor who had been crushed under the weight of arbitrary authority. In the days that followed the revelation of the fence and the turbulent meetings, I found that solitude no longer offered the comfort it once had. Instead, each day became a constant state of hypervigilance, my mind oscillating between crippling anxiety and the burning determination to reclaim my freedom. The metal fence, now an ever-present sentinel around my property, was a daily reminder of the oppressive force that had seized control of my life. I spent countless hours at the window, watching the surreal dance of shadows as the sun shifted, feeling as though my every move was scrutinized by unseen eyes. The sense of isolation deepened, and even the familiar sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves took on an eerie, almost mocking quality. The barrage of emails and phone calls from Victoria had grown increasingly frequent and hostile. Early one morning, as I struggled to break the cycle of insomnia, I was awoken by an urgent call from a neighbor whose trembling voice recounted how a group of HOA enforcers had been seen congregating near my property at dusk. That night, I installed additional security cameras along the fence and near the gate. Determined to document every instance of intrusion, I spent hours each night poring over the recordings, analyzing even the slightest movement, a shadow crossing a window, a whispered conversation in a distant yard. The footage became both a source of solace and torment as each new clip reinforced the reality that my sanctuary had been violated time and again. One particularly dismal evening, amid a downpour that blurred the outlines of the world outside, I found myself engaged in a long, tense phone conversation with Thomas. His voice, usually measured and calm, now quivered with frustration as he detailed complaints from other residents about Victoria's latest overreach. "You wouldn't believe the panic in Mrs. Henderson's voice when she said she saw a group of contractors circling her property," he confided, his tone heavy with worry. "There's talk of a plan. A plan to physically dismantle your fence and take that as a precedent." His words sent a chill through me, and I could almost see the looming image of a wrecking ball swinging against the barrier that so clearly symbolized our shared oppression. In the days following that conversation, my anxiety mounted into a constant background hum, a state of near-perpetual alertness that made every creak of the old house and every ripple in the backyard seem portentous. I documented each incident meticulously in a battered notebook, cross-referencing times, dates, and the number of suspicious individuals spotted around the perimeter. Every small detail took on monumental importance as I realized that the accumulative evidence would be critical in our fight for justice. At the same time, the isolation pressed upon me with an almost physical weight, as if the very walls of my farmhouse were conspiring to remind me of the solitary nature of rebellion. Nights turned into endless cycles of restless wandering through my darkened corridors. And even the act of stepping outside felt like a leap into an uncertain abyss. Yet in these moments of solitude, I also discovered unexpected clarity. The isolation forced me to confront not just the external battle waged by the HOA, but also the inner turmoil that had long been buried beneath the facade of my determined resolve. I began to journal my thoughts in earnest detail, words that captured the raw emotions of betrayal, fear, and unwavering hope. These entries, written in the quiet hours before dawn, became a vital part of my campaign, a means to channel the isolation into something transformative rather than destructive. One chilly evening, after hours of pacing and rewatching incriminating footage, I paused to survey the darkness beyond the fence. In that stillness, I imagined not an impenetrable barrier, but a temporary obstacle, a challenge to be overcome through sheer perseverance and collective will. I recalled the faces of the neighbors who had quietly shown their support in the margins of whispered conversations, realizing that my solitary fight had, in truth, become a beacon for many who had suffered in silence. The isolation was no longer a sentence. It was the crucible in which the battle for justice was being forged. In a moment of rare introspection, I allowed myself to speak aloud to the empty room, as if trying to affirm my own existence against the backdrop of relentless adversity. "I am not alone," I declared, the words echoing off the peeling walls. "And I refuse to let fear dictate the rhythm of my life." In the months that followed, our journey toward rebuilding continued with renewed optimism. We organized community festivals that celebrated our diversity and resilience. And I found myself frequently addressing gatherings of neighbors, urging them to remain vigilant and proactive in safeguarding our rights. The lessons of our hard-won battle became the cornerstone of a new narrative, a story where every person's voice mattered, and where the collective conscience of the community could triumph over even the most entrenched abuses of power. As I pen these reflections on a tranquil autumn afternoon, the sun dipping low in the horizon and casting golden hues over fields once marked by division, I cannot help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude and purpose. The scars of our past remain as bittersweet reminders of the cost of freedom. Yet, they also serve as beacons illuminating the promise of a better tomorrow. And so, as I close this chapter of my life, I extend a heartfelt invitation to every reader: stand up for what is right. Hold fast to your dignity. And never allow tyranny to shackle your dreams. For in the echoes of our struggle, there lies an enduring message. A testament that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is simply to reclaim one's own destiny.